Hi everyone, in today's video I'll guide you through the process of creating lineless artwork. There are a lot of different line art free styles and I'm going to focus on two specific styles, one that is more simple and consists of inner lines and textures, and another style with a more realistic but still stylized rendering of the character. In the background right now I'm preparing a sketch of my girl Diabolosa, who will serve as today's test subject. I'll be using the same sketch for both styles, so you can clearly see the two different methods I use to create two different styles. And as usual, if you're interested in the entire real-time video process of this drawing, go to my Patreon and sign up on the Hero tier before April 1st. The Hero tier is $5 a month and includes exclusive video content such as real-time video or slow versions of my YouTube videos, Procreate time-lapses, as well as all of my references used, and all lower tier rewards as well, of course. So, when you do lineless artwork, there usually goes a lot more detail into the sketch phase, especially if you use the method for the first style that we'll get started with now. The reason for that is that we'll end up hiding the sketch completely at some point, so it has to show enough details for us to base our coloring and inner lines on. You're basically going straight to coloring and shading and skipping the whole line art process, which we would usually use as a guide for our base coloring. I will lower the opacity of the sketch and make sure it sits on top of all of my layers at all time. For this first style, we'll mainly be using a combination of a lasso tool, maybe in some other software called the free selection tool, and a textured brush. We'll start by creating a new layer for each of our color blockings. And a color blocking is just a big blob of color. Also, I'll refer to it as my color flats. We'll start with the skin layer here. Use the lasso tool to trace the outline of the character's skin. When you've made a selection, you can hold down the Shift key to add the next selection you make to the one you just made. See how there's a little plus symbol next to the lasso? It means that you will add to your selection. If you hold down the Alt key, you'll notice that there's a minus icon instead, and now you'll be removing parts of your selection instead. The reason you can add and remove things to your selection is that it's sometimes really hard to get the entire selection in one go, so I just take smaller parts of it and then add on as I go. And here's a tip: if you at some point by mistake deselect everything, you can just use Ctrl-Z to go one step back and your selection will reappear. If you're not comfortable using the lasso tool, you can just use a very hard brush with zero spacing and do the color blocking manually. And here's another tip for you. Once you've drawn the outline of the shape and you want to fill it in, grab the magic wand tool and select the inside of the shape that you want to fill. Then go to Select, Modify, and choose Expand. Choose how many pixels you want to expand your selection with. Hit OK, and now you can see how the selection has expanded out on top of your outline. Now go to Edit and choose Fill. Choose from this drop-down menu to fill with a color and pick off the color from somewhere on your canvas and hit OK. Doing this thing where we expand the selection first doesn't leave any white pixels left, as it would have been if you had just used the bucket tool to fill in the color. Use a hard brush and an eraser to edit parts to your liking. I'm coloring over the hair here because the hair is going to sit on another layer on top, so it will get covered up either way. Do the same thing for the rest of your color blockings or your color flats. If you have a very detailed character, this process might take a while, but keeping all elements separated with a crisp edge, provided you're using either a hard brush or the lasso tool, will really be worth it later on. You probably noticed that while I was making the selection for the hair, I also had a lot of the selection go over the skin. Since the hair layer is going to be on top of the skin layer, that'd be a problem, right? Well, you are in luck, because this is digital art, so we can just of course fix it with one single click. Once you've made the selection for the hair, you can hold down Ctrl and Alt and click on the little thumbnail for the skin layer. Notice how this little box has a minus in it? It means that when you click, it will deselect all the content on the layer you clicked. So now we're removing all the skin layer's content from the active selection on the hair layer. And now I'll add in the part of the selection that actually will go over the skin. Since we already have a selection, just use the fill tool to fill in the hair color. There's no need to expand the selection because we didn't do any outline with the brush here. And now I'm just going to quickly do the rest of the color blocking using the same method explained before. Now we've made it past the color blocking and it's time to start forming the character. This style is going to have inner lines and a flat finish. To give her a little more character and edge, I will be using a highly textured brush to contrast to the flat colors. On a new layer, I start coloring in the face, still tightly using the sketch as my reference. You decide if you want to use the lasso tool for this part too, but I'd rather use a hard brush with very little spacing and my free hand to shape her so she will appear a little less vectorized. A characteristic to this style is that there are no outer lines, but we use inner lines to separate planes of the same color. Since the blackness and the whiteness of the eyes are contrast enough, we do not need line art to tell these parts apart, but we need something to separate the nose from the rest of the skin, or she won't have a nose. In this case, we will use a darker skin color to create a line where the nose goes. The same goes for the inner ears, and you can do it as well in the area that separate the head from the neck. But we'll use a different method for that later, you'll see. For these lines, I'm using a brush from Kyle's drawing box. It has a lot of texture and I think it looks really nice against a solid flat color. Kyle's mega brush set, by the way, is free. You just have to Google it and it's very easy to find. Once I'm done with the inner lines on her skin, I move on to painting her lips. They don't need lines either because there's enough contrast between the lip color and the skin color. Now I'll be moving on to the hair, and this is where I'll start using the textured brush for shading. The brush here is part of Dave Grego's brush set. You can download them from his YouTube channel, and if you haven't already subbed to his channel, I consider it a sin worth of being punished for. I'm using alpha locking while shading Diabolosa here. Alpha locking means that you can paint only on the existing pixels on the layer, meaning you can't draw outside your color blocking. It's like a clipping mask, except you're not working on a new layer. You can also do a clipping mask if you're more comfortable with that. It's basically the same thing. With the lasso tool, I start dividing the hair into different sections using the sketch as my reference. Once I've made a selection, I'll take a big textured brush in the desired color and paint over with a few lighter strokes. I want texture to be visible, so careful not to paint too much. The purpose here is to create sharp separations between different sections of the hair. By adding textured strokes, you can often soften out sharp selections a bit, so it doesn't look too much like paper cut art. Once the sectioning is done, I'm adding inner lines to draw out the details in the hair, and finally I'm adding some highlights to give the hair an extra dimension so it doesn't look so flat. Another approach you can use instead of drawing inner lines to separate planes of the same color is by using shadows and highlights as contrast. Here I'm adding some flat shadows on her neck and then erasing the line that before separated the neck from the head. The shadow serves the exact same purpose as that line. In other areas, such as under her nose, I keep the dark inner lines and use shadows as well. How you decide to shade and how much you want to use inner lines is up to you. Here I'm using a combination of shadows and inner lines. When you paint in flats like this, you can use the magic wand tool to quickly make a selection of a painted area, even if you have two separate colors on the same layer. In my case here, I have the white and the yellow flats of the eyes on the same layer. I use the magic wand tool and click on the color in the eye and recolor them. There's enough contrast between these two for the magic wand tool to figure out that I only want to make a selection of one of them. Then I select the white area afterwards and paint them yellow. So even if you had painted all of your flats or color blocking on the same layer, you can still pick out the different parts and isolate them while working on them, because the Magic Wand tool differentiates in contrast. As a final touch to Diabolos's face, I use a very textured brush to give her cheeks some structure and some warmth, along with a couple of textured highlights as well. Again, the contrast between the smooth surface and the rough surfaces just looks really neat. For a shirt, I use lighter inner lines to show the folds. And that concludes the first and more simple lineless style. The next one will have a much more polished and overall rendered look. The technique I'm about to teach you now is basically the same that I'm currently using for all of my artwork when I paint with no or loose line art. It always varies a bit from drawing to drawing, but the overall approach is the same. But before we move on, I want to thank the sponsor of this video, which is Skillshare. And let's be honest, I would be a fool if I thought you didn't know what Skillshare is at this point. You know, the online learning community for artists and creatives alike, where people come to grow and advance on their creative journeys with thousands of classes to choose from and real projects to create and learn from. Whether you want to improve your creative writing, master a specific art medium, or want to start animation or an art career, Skillshare got that and much more. I use Skillshare a lot when I started out as a freelance artist. I took classes on how to manage work, how to set realistic goals, realistic prices, and it was a really good kickstarter for me. And because most classes are less than 1 hour long, I could watch one whole class in a day in my small breaks or while I was on the toilet with my phone, which was perfect. If you decided back in January that 2020 is the year where you will start making some income on your art, I recommend you watch this class called Make a Living as an Artist: Strategies for Crafting Your Creative Business by Brooke Glaser. Use it to get an idea of all of the sorts of ways you can make a living or secondary income as an artist. And as usual, I offer you 2 free months of access to Skillshare Premium, but it's limited to the first 500 people who click the link in the description, so do it now and claim your spot. And if you can't get enough learning, Skillshare is also pretty affordable with an annual premium membership for less than $10 a month. It's never too late to start learning, people, so why not just go start today? Thanks for listening, guys, and a huge thanks to Skillshare for the continued support of my channel. Let's move on with the video. For the second lineless style, I'm just reusing the flats or the color blocks I already did on the first styles, since I would be painting the flats in anyway. I just grouped all the layers together, duplicated the group, and removed the layers I didn't need until I was left with only the flats as a starting point. So far, so good. One of the things that makes this approach so much different from the first style is that I'm going to actually include the sketch in my shading, but we will end up covering it up almost completely by a mix of coloring the lines and overpainting them. First, I place the sketch on top of the flats and clean it up a little. Then I lower the opacity of it for now. On a new layer, clipping down as a mask to the skin layer, I start adding some shading. I use the lasso tool to make selections on the face I want to add shading to, and with a big soft airbrush I make sort of like a gradiated or fading shading? Fading shading? Faded shading? Fading shading? I'm sorry. Don't worry about the sharp edges because you can always smudge them out later if you don't think they fit in. I now also have a clipping mask for the sketched layer, so I can paint the lines over with the same color as the skin, so it looks like they're not really there at all. Then I will shade as I would normally do. Here I'm using Dave Greco's main brush and I'm painting in shadows and highlights on the face. And once in a while I return to the color mask for the sketch and color in some lines, slowly hiding more and more of the lines away. I continue to use a mix of blocking out shapes with my brush or the lasso tool as I shade the rest of the face. I'm adding this shadow on this other side of the nose because it contours the nose shape, and I can paint over the line art because it's no longer needed. Remember what I said earlier, it's about creating contrast with your shading, which essentially is the same thing that line art would have done. Now I have made a new top layer called render. Whatever I paint on this layer will go on top of all of the layers below it, even the sketch layer. Use your render layer or layers, or whatever you want to call them, to paint over everything you want to cover beneath it. I also use this layer to add details later on. Today I'm creating a separate render layer for the hair. I'm shading the hair directly on the render layer using a variety of colors to serve as contrast so you can tell the different sections of the hair apart, so it appears less as just one big blob. Another thing you can do while shading the hair so it appears more natural is to use both thick and thin strokes to create much more life and variety in the hair strands. And from here on I am mainly working on the render layers on top using the lasso tool to separate some areas I want to work on. I'm just adding shadows and highlights using a mix of a soft airbrush, Greco's main brush and my own main brushes. Another tip for painting hair is to break the big main shapes you already have with smaller strokes, so it seems like the hair consists of a lot of small sections rather than a few big ones. And to separate the bun away from the rest of the hair on the head without using line art, I made a selection around it and used a big airbrush with a shadow color to gently add a faded shadow. The contrast between the dark and the light area will look like an invisible line, but much more natural than traditional line art. By reversing the selection afterward and adding a little highlight to the hair on the head, I make the contrast even more dominant. And with the same color, I continue to add highlights to the hair for further depth. For the black clothes, I use a lasso tool to select some folds and paint them in with a soft airbrush and a lighter color. The mix of using the hard edges here and faded shading gives a very three-dimensional look. After that, it's time to add the last details. The initial sketch is now almost completely hidden by the shading on top of it, and I am primarily using my own main brushes to add these last details. And for no other reason than the sake of comparison, I made a duplicate of the second style and put the sketch layer on top as if it was line art. It's not as clean as line art, even after I cleaned it up a bit, but it should give you an idea of how different line art makes art look. And line art is wonderful. In fact, I love line art. Probably one of my favorite parts about drawing ever. But sometimes we just want a different outcome. And here I have walked you through how to achieve that in 2 different ways. I really hope that I explained it well enough and that you found it useful. I would really appreciate it if you would give the video a thumbs up if you liked it, because it helps my channel so much. And remember to claim one of the 500 spots of 2 free months of Skillshare Premium using the link in the description. And lastly, check out my Patreon if you want extra content and longer videos. This video will be in real time and part of Term 12 released in early April 2020. I can finally breathe. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and until next time, take care. Bye!